Our text comes from Mark chapter 6, verses 14 through 29. We didn't get the opportunity to read it together, so let us right now. King Herod heard about this, for Jesus' name has been well known. Some were saying that John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him. Others said he is Elijah, and still others claimed he is a prophet, like one of the prophets of long ago. But when Herod heard this, he said, John, the man I beheaded, has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had given orders to have John arrested, and he had him bound and put in prison. He did this because of Herodias, his brother's wife, whom he had married. For John had been saying to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. So Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him, but she was not able to because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous man and holy. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled and yet liked to listen to him. Now you, as the audience, can read the rest together. Okay? Shall we? Finally, we've heard this story so many times it doesn't shock us anymore. The reality is that very rarely is anything worthwhile easy. There are pains in doing practically everything. Exercising is hard. Studying is hard. Loving our spouse is sometimes very hard. Talk to all the married people. They'll tell you. Working for the Lord is hard. Praying is hard. Being consistent in studying the Bible or reading His Word is hard. Living a righteous life is hard. It's much easier for us to let our guards down and do whatever we want. But our calling from the Lord is to live differently. We don't live like the world. When we live or try to live a righteous life, we want a reward, not persecution. But the world does not work that way, and sometimes we don't even work like that. We oppose ourselves because we don't want the conviction. And here is an example of the world not receiving the righteousness that is declared to it. It takes a great amount of self-control to live above the norm. it takes so much more power to swim upstream than it is to swim down. So our calling from the Lord is to be wholly different and altogether opposing the unrighteousness that is going on. What we read here is a shocking story, an incident, or account of what happened in the days of John the Baptist and Jesus, where a man was actually beheaded. Now, they didn't have YouTube back then, and they didn't film it and plaster it all over the kingdom so that everybody would notice or know it. So all they could do is hear about it. Today we could actually see it. So when ISIS beheads a brother or a sister in the Lord, we totally get shocked, but that was not the first time that has ever happened. Here is Herod beheading a member of God's family, and we should all be shocked because of that. But ever since then, we anticipate or expect that that would happen. The king, of course, knows what goes on in his kingdom. Herod knew what was going on in his kingdom, and especially what John the Baptist was saying about his relationship with his current wife. Now, why was that? Well, the reason why Herod objected, or Herodias to be more precise, Herod and Herodias objected to John the Baptist preaching. He said, "You are committing adultery." And what was the nature of the adultery? Well, Jesus clearly said, and this was already understood generally, that if you divorce somebody and you marry somebody else, then you are committing adultery. If you divorce somebody but don't ever get married, then you haven't committed adultery. You see what I mean? As soon as you divorce somebody and marry somebody else, you are committing adultery. If you just divorce, that's not adultery because you haven't physically united yourself with somebody else other than your spouse. This is precisely what Jesus was talking about, what Paul was talking about in the New Testament, that if you break your vow with your spouse, you commit adultery if you commit or take another vow with somebody else. Alright? So Paul says, this is what you're supposed to do. If you ever get divorced, you got to stay unmarried for the rest of your life. Or you get married to the same person that you divorced. In other words, you get remarried to the same person that you married before and got a divorce. So, because this was so difficult, the disciples said, well, then, it's good never to marry. No. Listen, if you want to get married, understand what you're getting into. Don't look for a way out. Stay with her for life. Stay with him for life. So, John the Baptist, knowing this, understanding this, says to Herod, probably indirectly, I'm not certain that he went up to King Herod. He probably never had an audience with him. Apart from maybe, far in the background, indirectly, most likely, pictured for him the scenario that you cannot marry somebody after you get a divorce, which he probably did a number of times. Herodias was actually his sister-in-law, because his brother Philip used to be married to her, and she divorced her, or he snatched her. Don't know how exactly it happened, but the reality was she became Herod's wife. And when she became Herod's wife, John the Baptist objected. He probably got a number of questions, moral questions, during his preaching, and one of those questions was, is it okay for me to marry my ex-sister-in-law? And the scenario most likely came up, and so when he answered the question, he also condemned the relationship with Herod and his current wife, Herodias. So, how did Herod handle it? He didn't handle it at all. He just ignored it. He didn't care what he thought. Morally speaking, Herod said, so what? He believes that? I don't believe that. So what? I don't care. However, Herodias, his wife, didn't like the preaching, objected to this objection of John the Baptist. She didn't like the fact that he was declaring publicly that this was an immoral relationship that she was in. And bitterly trying to get rid of him, but she could not because Herod actually liked to listen to John the Baptist. But here, they were contemplating the reality of the resurrection. Jesus started doing all kinds of miracles, similar to John the Baptist, who was a preacher, didn't do a whole lot. There's not a miracle actually recorded that John the Baptist performed, but in his preaching was similar to Jesus, and so they thought, well, maybe John the Baptist was raised from the dead and living his life through this character called Jesus. And so then Herod is being reminded, and Herodias is being reminded, that something is going on here. Before that, Herod was conscience-stricken because what was going on was a reminder of all the stuff that Jesus used to do, or John the Baptist used to do. And he was reminded of the fact that he had killed John the Baptist, so that these things are recurring and his conscience is being raised. He hadn't confessed that he did wrong, or he may have had some regret, but it wasn't a righteous confession for him. He was just regretting the fact that it happened. In Proverbs chapter 28, verse 13, it says that if we confess, it leads to mercy, but if we hold on to, I'm paraphrasing, if we hold on to sin, if we conceal it, then our bodies will waste away. Okay? Let me give you a personal example. When I was, I think, 7 or 8 years old, my neighbor showed me this well-made, handmade knife with a skillful wrapping for a handle. Took I think nylon, and he wrapped the handle, really, really well, and I saw it and I said, wow, that's great. It looks fantastic. I wish I could have one. And I remember when he was gone, he had it sitting down, I suppose. I don't remember precisely how I ended up with it, but it was in front of me. He was gone, and so I decided that I wanted it, and I took it. Okay? I stole it. Right? And then afterwards, I had to lie to the guy, because then I had to tell him I didn't see it. Okay? So I had this nice thing, but I couldn't use it in public because then I would be found out, right? I could only use it in private. And then in the process of using it, the handle unraveled. And then for me, it was like useless now because the beauty and the attraction was gone, so I threw it away. Yeah, some of you are probably thinking, yeah, I did something like that. Yeah. But after I stole it, I couldn't look at him the same way that I used to look at him. Everything that I saw reminded me that I did that. If I see a yarn, if I see a piece of metal, I mean, in random places and in all situations, I will be reminded that I stole something. But I didn't do anything about it. I didn't go back and confess and ask for forgiveness. I'll pay for it. None of that stuff. I mean, I was young, but I could have made some effort to make restitution. That was not even in my radar. I just wanted to get away with it. I was so convicted about it that I just hoped that I would never be caught. Okay? To this day, okay, it still bothers me. And I can't go back to Korea and say, hey, where's this guy who used to live next door? And I don't even know what he looks like. Can't even remember. Okay? So how am I supposed to undo that? After I became a Christian, it became a huge problem. Because all of these things that I did came back to me and I couldn't do a thing about it. I remember switching a price tag on a hose. And this was a store, we went to the store, this is a nice hose here, and a so-so hose here. I switched the price tag, I went to the register, paid for it, went home. Got a nice hose for a cheaper price, okay? And I'm going, okay, after I became a Christian, it became a huge problem because those things kept being resurrected in my mind. And all these resurrections were hurting me. I'm going, how do I deal with that? And then when I became a Christian, that's what I'm talking about. When I became a Christian, I said, Lord, how do I deal with that? And you know what he said? He said in Ephesians, he who has been stealing, steal no longer. But do something useful with your hands that he may contribute to the needs of those around him, right? So that's what I had to do, even though I couldn't do a thing about it. I mean, what was done was done. I can't go back. The store's not even there anymore. Okay? My friend, I can't track him down. I can't go to Korea, just to make things right. If I remembered his name, I could probably befriend him on Facebook and then confess and send him money. But I don't even remember his name. So the resurrection keeps happening in my conscience, and I couldn't do a thing about it. Now what I have to do is just have to be generous to other people to make up for that. So, the resurrection of his conscience keeps coming up, and Herod had an issue with this because he had John the Baptist incarcerated and ultimately beheaded because of his power. But he wasn't directly sort of responsible for his death. He was more like an indirect accomplice. He was coerced into doing it. He gave a party. And the party was, of course, for dignitaries. And you know what happens at parties, right? There was an Asian, we can't call it an Asian club. It was a club that was predominantly frequented by Asians. Okay? And two Vietnamese men had an argument with a Korean guy. And the argument ended up being too intense, and the two Vietnamese guys went home, or went somewhere, brought a gun, came back to the club while he was still there, and shot the guy. Dead. Okay. And of course this became big news, and this was at a party. stupid stuff happens at parties, unrighteous parties. And this was not a very, very righteous party. This was a narcissistic party. Herod was throwing a party for his own birthday. He's doing his own party. And dignitaries were there. And the parties last a long time, days. Okay? And he's showing off his kingdom. And he asked his daughter, who was performing or practicing and doing recitals and learning how to dance, and said, "Hey, would you, or please, dance for us?" And in his drunkenness, he was so impressed with his stepdaughter's dancing, he told her, and now remember, he's still in a drunken stupor. He told her, "Look, ask for whatever you want. I want to reward you for this immaculate performance, and ask for whatever you want, up to half of the kingdom I'll give you." Okay? Now let's track down this half of the kingdom business, because it was actually a indication of generosity, not necessarily a strict promise that if you do ask for half the kingdom, I'll give it to you. It's an indication of generosity. And the reason why they said half the kingdom was because, remember, if you own a company, you own the company. If you own slightly above 50%, 50.00001%, you still own it. Okay? It's the law. So he's saying up to 49.999% I'll give you, because I still have to rule. I can't let you rule. Right? And this was a phrase that was also used in the Old Testament. But right afterwards you can see, okay, because Xerxes offered that to Esther. She was already queen anyway. But the offering was an indication of generosity, because you can see what was requested afterwards. So if your parents say, "Oh, look, I'll give you everything up to half the house," you're not going to say, "Okay, give me half the house." You're not going to do that. You say, "Well, I would like to go, to Ocean City for my senior graduation party. Would that be all right?" And then, sure, okay? Because that's not half the house. It's not half of all my property, half of all my stocks, and half of all my, whatever. So it's not like that. And so Herod was just being generous. He says, "Ask for whatever you want. Okay, let your imagination go wild," right? But if she had said, "Okay, I want half the kingdom," he would have said, "Come on, I wasn't serious." He wouldn't have said that. Okay? He wouldn't have given it to her. This is a mid-teen young girl. How's she going to rule half of his kingdom? It's possible. Okay? So we have to understand this. And so then, when she is told that that's what would happen, she in her mid-teens, lower teens, mid-teens, didn't know. Had no idea what to ask for. What should I ask for? I don't know. Well, being a mother's daughter, okay? Being a mother's daughter, and most likely very, very controlling mom, because you can see that here, okay? So a controlling mom who enslaved her daughter to do whatever mom wanted her to do, had no idea what to ask for, so she runs over to her mother and says, "Herod just gave me a blank check. Said I can ask for whatever I want." And what does she say? "Oh, make sure that you have a college fund in the bank. Make sure that when you turn 16, you get a brand new chariot. And when you get married, make sure that he buys your house. Make that all in writing." She didn't even care about her daughter. What she said was, "I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter, right here, right now." It was about her, not about her daughter. So what does she do? Being the slave of her mother, she runs to Herod and says, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter right here, right now. And Herod was shocked. Now remember, Herod liked to listen to John the Baptist. Even though he may have disagreed with him, even though he said, yeah, he's against our marriage, the things that came out of his mouth intrigued him. He was a novelty to Herod. And the philosophy that John the Baptist spoke of actually made sense to him, but he didn't want to do it. Is probably, most likely, the situation. It's like some people like Christianity, but in order to really be living it, it's way too difficult for them, so they just entertain it. They may just go to church and say, yeah, those things are nice, but it takes way too much commitment, and I'm not willing to just go all out. I'll just participate. I'll just listen. I'll just hang out with the nice people. So, are you treating Jesus like Herod is treating John the Baptist? Intrigued, but uncommitted. Until pressure comes from the outside to get rid of it. And if your friend said to you, Jesus, you believe in that religious stuff? Now you gotta hide it. You gotta hide Christianity from your good friends or your influential friends. Herod didn't want to do it, but it was way too late because now he's getting peer pressure that he has to commit or this act, or he has to follow up on his word. He has to keep his promise. Because he offered it to her, he said, whatever you want. He had the authority to have John the Baptist beheaded. And so the dignitaries are all looking at him and going, okay, now what's he going to do? Is he going to follow up on his word, or is he going to deny her and say something else and lose his face? The pressure was too much for Herod, so he had him beheaded right there in jail. This was peer pressure. This was drunkenness. This was irresponsibility. This was all Herod. The unrighteous man just killed a righteous man. So let me give you some guidelines in terms of how to respond to this story, this account of what Herod did, so that we can avoid some of it. Okay. Now, let's start with just a simple thing like don't sin, because your sin would track you down. Okay? Don't sin. Don't steal. Don't do anything unrighteous, because it will track you down. If nothing else, your conscience will bother you for the rest of your life. See, what is so secondarily understood is the pleasure of doing something wrong far is harder to handle than the difficulty of doing what is right and then being able to relax about it. The pressure to undo what was wrongly done is harder than the pressure of defeating it and not doing it and then standing on it. So, what God has done is He has given us automatic consequences when we do something wrong. In our conscience, He says, if you do something wrong, and you don't even have to know the rules, right? You don't even have to know that it's unlawful, like written down and somebody told you. It could just be something that you are not supposed to do. You know it in your conscience.